Flutes are expensive, especially professional ones, so I can understand wanting to go for it when you see a good deal. But when you see a Senkyo CF601, a $16,700 flute available for 190 Australian, surely you would have sailed right past too good to be true and crashed into blatant scam territory. Though, what's this? 21 people have bought it and 4 have left 5-star reviews? Well now, this just got very interesting. And as the owner of a real Senkyo flute, I was curious, what's the difference between a real Senkyo and a 5-star Chinese knockoff? So I gave AliExpress my credit card info and here it is. Alright, and here we have it, what is supposedly a Senkyo CF601 flute. The CF601 is the most expensive sterling silver Senkyo flute. By comparison, my Senkyo looks like a student flute. It is an older model Senkyo Etude, which is now called the Senkyo CF201, aka the cheapest flute that Senkyo sells. Even so, if you wanted to buy a new Senkyo CF201 rather than a used older model like I did, you'll still need to be spending about $5,000 in Australia and about $5,000 US if you're in the States. So it should still be interesting to see how a used version of the cheapest Senkyo compares to a cheap Chinese knockoff. Here we have the case, and that's already a zipper that's not zipped up properly. They say first impressions last a lifetime. Now you may be asking yourself, how do you know for certain that this is genuinely a fake? Well, if the price wasn't a giveaway and the fact that there's no Senkyo branding on this case or on the bag or on the cloth and the gloves that seem to come with every single Chinese flute I've ever seen, it would be the listing itself, because in the listing they claim that this is silver-plated copper and nickel, aka nickel silver, which is the typical material that you would make a cheap student flute out of. Although to their credit, I do say cheap student flute, but they could have skimped even further. That is the material traditionally used in student and less professional instruments. Open it, and immediately we see another oddity. This is cork grease, I believe. Looks something like a cork grease, which shouldn't be used on silver flutes. As the name implies, cork grease is to... Okay, seems like they expect us to be taking it apart. Now, I am going to be rather nitpicky as I look at this, but I do have to say, it's going to have to be quite terrible for this to be a bad deal. I mean, I said at the beginning that it was $190, but actually it's a lot less when you factor in the extra deals I was able to get with the coupon codes. There's our body. One interesting thing is, included inside the body was the cleaning cloth. That's rather odd to me, because they did come with a bag that has a pocket for a cleaning cloth. Why did they need to put it on the inside? Here we have our head joint, and here is our foot joint. Okay, well the case has immediately broken. Let's just force that back in there. Having a look at it, it's not particularly clean. There does seem to be a bit of grime on there even before my fingers got to it. Also, the finish is not quite perfect. In fact, quite far from it. There's lots and lots and lots of scratches. To me, this looks more like a very lightly used flute rather than a brand new one. Immediately, it looks like some of these keys are broken, but actually they've just been stoppered with these foam blocks, which is rather interesting. Now I'll get open this foot joint. Another thing I'm noticing right off the bat is that these pads are very uneven. Some of them are bulging out a lot more than some of the others are. That indicates to me that their manufacturing of their tone holes isn't quite flat, but we'll see if whether or not that's a problem later. Another thing while I'm looking at it is that these pads have very significant little rims. That means that they're probably quite soft. The benefit of having a soft pad versus a hard pad on a flute is that by having a soft pad, it conforms to differences in the tone hole much more easily, so you can have a less precisely machined tone hole and therefore make a cheaper flute. It's also better for some antique instruments where they didn't have the ability to make super precise flutes like we do today. Typically what soft pads do is they result in your notes taking a little bit more time in order to really come through properly. That makes you sound over overall more dark when you're slurring or trilling, for example. Some people actually like this sound and very intentionally use soft pads, and that's especially true on antique instruments where they sort of lean towards that darker sound anyway, so the darker pads complement the darker sound. That said, there is a difference between using soft, good quality pads that are intended to be soft in the right way and just using bad pads. We'll see which one these are later, but for now, just to have a quick look at my genuine Sankyo, the pads are a lot more even, meaning our tone holes are probably made a bit better, even though this is an older flute. And the pads have much less significant rims on them, which is especially significant as this flute desperately needs a servicing. It'd probably be even better if it had one. Yeah, they made this to sit on a table much more nicely than their rip-off counterparts did. I can also say that the real Sankyo has a much lighter mechanism and also seems to feel a bit more consistent to my touch. And again, that's with it being quite a lot older and probably in need of a service. Although you cannot fault the Chinese knockoff for not having a huge amount of features. It comes with a split E, a B foot joint with a gizmo, open holes, and pointed key arms. Not even mine has pointed key arms. Though if you were to buy a modern one, it would. This is just a factor of changing fashion and trends in the flute industry. Another fine detail that you might not notice just looking at it from the get-go is how nice the foot joint is by how precise it is. You can see that on this foot joint, they've had some serious gaps put in there. That's likely because of the reduced manufacturing tolerances. It means that by having those bigger gaps, more flutes get through the production line without needing to be changed. And another cost-saving measure is using plastic under our keys. And well, yep, they're on the trill keys as well. Looking at these trill keys, they're very soft pads. This is definitely at the point where we're not talking about a soft pad that's just been chosen to be lenient or for a darker sound but still high quality. This is just not a very good quality pad. Being this soft means that that little bit of attack that's meant to be at the beginning of the note, the thing that makes it sound a little bit darker, is now just going to be a bit gone. And instead of that, we're going to have just the beginning of our note not exist at all. To give you an idea of what I mean, I'm going to play the trill key on this real Sankyo, and there's going to be a little bit of a cutoff as the key starts to open, but then the note's going to come back rather quickly. Not so bad for a key that's meant to be played very quickly. In fact, about as good as you can get on a non-open hole key. Whereas on this flute, there's going to be a much larger dead zone because of that way too soft pad. In fact, it almost seems like we never get the tone back to begin with, even ignoring the fact that the start of the note is just completely gone. This is making me wonder about the quality of the tone holes themselves. Are they using soft pads to cheap out on pads? Or are they using soft pads to make up for their poor quality tone holes? The areas where the keys have been soldered is a lot more messy on the Chinese flute. There's also some much more obvious areas where the parts have been put together. On the Sankyo, it feels like they were trying to hide the marks where the flute was being made, whereas on this, well, they haven't had the time, so they've simply not bothered. Lots of little details feel quite substantially different. Whether it's the felted keys on the Sankyo, making those keys quieter, the wide spacing on the B foot joint also makes it rather uncomfortable to cover all of the keys. I have to push it up in order to comfortably play the C sharp, but I have to push it back down in order to comfortably play the B. As for other little differences, Sankyo's engraving is clearly better on their barrels. You can see quite clearly the differences between the two. That is the least happy crown I've ever taken off. Ah, lots of cork dust, that would explain that. The barrel's also not aligned with the keys. It's all these strange little details, and they are little details, but it's not confidence inspiring when you skimp on small things, because if you have a lackluster attitude about simple things that aren't that difficult to do, then what's your attitude about more advanced things? In any case, I think it's time that we move on from just looking at these instruments on a first impressions basis. We're going to be doing a lot more to them, including taking them apart to see where these small little differences add up and see whether or not they add up into something that actually matters. Alright, it's now a new day. I've spent about a week playing this instrument and collecting my thoughts, which means it's now time to take it apart and see what might be going on underneath the surface. Now, I did bring along my own screwdriver to do the dismantling, but don't need it. Seems like they expect us to do it ourselves, so they provided one. All right, now we get to have our first look, and that's very interesting. Having a look inside the tone holes, I can actually see quite a lot of machining marks, especially in this one. It's quite scraped up. I'm also quite interested in having a look at these pads. Oh my word. So we're seeing what I was mentioning before about those grooves. But interestingly, it's not actually even. It's a little bit lighter on this side, which means that this pad, despite being at quite a substantial angle, still probably needed to come a bit more biased in that direction. These tone holes must not be very flat. Either that or the way that the key sits over the top of the tone hole is not very flat. Looking at the soldering of the keys, they also aren't touching quite as much as they really should be. And you can see the balling of where the solder has flowed and made a little bit of a puddle, not quite filling the gap. You can also see what I assume is remnants from the cast. So they would have most likely cast these keys and then ground down all of the roughness that casting can get you into making a nice, smooth, polished looking part, and then not bother to do it in the bits that you're not going to see. For an instrument that's built to a price, that's fair enough realistically. I mean, if time is money, then why spend your time and your money on things that don't affect performance? Interestingly though, we can see that this key solder is much better applied. It's really quite interesting. I wonder if that changes where I think it does. This key soldering not being quite as precise has moved the pad cup this way, which explains why the pad is so far from level. It's actually that the key cup seems to have been soldered on wrong. And that also could potentially have caused the angle that meant that the pad needed to be seated like that. That's very interesting. So we're looking at the compilation of multiple small issues resulting in something that's bigger than any one of those small issues. Seems like a consistent trend with this flute. This is literally just a little bit of sheet that's been soldered on to the key there. That's really quite funny. Again, built to a price, fair enough. All right, full comparison, we're also going to take apart my Senkyo's foot joint. Naturally, don't try this at home unless you're willing to ruin your instrument. I have a backup flute and have taken apart my flute several times, and so I'm comfortable doing so again. But unless you're willing to risk causing damage, treat this as an I did it for you so that you don't have to moment. Looking at the Senkyo, the tone holes are far more nicely made. Another thing we can look at are these keys. You can also see that Senkyo's little bit here is incorporated into the design of the key, rather than just being a tiny little plate that's been soldered on. If you're wondering, that bit is there so that when you play C, it also pushes the C sharp pad down. Now the bit that I really want to look at, the rims on these pads, my goodness. That is an insane rim on that rip-off flute. By comparison, if you look at the Senkyo, it also has a rim on it, but if you look closely, that rim you can only really see because it's dark. That darkness is probably just small amounts of tarnish rubbing away on the pad over time. These pads are quite old, really could do with replacing, which further just goes to show you the difference between these two. That really rather matters. What that means is that your notes are going to be far, far less responsive. Rather than being flat like this so that the air can immediately escape, your pad is effectively curved like this, and as far as the tone hole is concerned, is kind of giving it a hug. Can't escape yet, can't escape, now it can escape, versus just immediately be able to release. That's what I was meaning before about how you can have soft pads, which are really there to make up for some of the inaccuracies in your tone hole. There's a difference between that sort of a soft pad, where it's still a good quality pad, just made to make up for some issues with the flute. Very small issues. This is just a problematic pad that's so soft, it's beyond reason. In fact, I'll get you another example. This is a pad from my first flute. This is a great example of a pad which is soft, and it's soft to make up for the problems in the tone hole. That is a good quality pad that's just made for a less precise, affordable instrument. And then this is a firm pad that's made for an instrument that has tighter tolerances and so can have a firmer, more responsive pad. You can see this has a little tiny bit of a groove. This pad doesn't have so much of a groove. It's very, very small and most of what you can see is just color. Then you have this whopper. And this sort of pad has more issues than just your flute's articulation isn't as responsive as it could be. That's what you get with this sort of a pad versus this pad. This is now getting to the point where the instrument is potentially harmful to play because you have to press down quite hard in order to get notes out. This is actually one of the biggest problems I have with this instrument, is that it's quite fatiguing to play. And it's also bad technique. First of all, by pressing so hard, you can hurt yourself, but also pressing so hard means it's much harder to play quickly. And the flute's really meant for you to have quite a light touch. This is just not really acceptable. That said, under $200. It is a functioning flute for under $200. But I feel like we might have a straw that broke the camel's back situation soon with how many little issues are compounding up. Oh, and actually, just quickly, it gets even better. This is a key from a flute made by Aldi, which was used, which I bought from an op shop. Now, this isn't a good example either. You can see quite clearly that the rim on this pad is very biased towards, well, at least from my perspective, the right-hand side. It was very light on the left-hand side. That means this pad wasn't put on properly. It really needed to be more flat and more even across the whole pad. And yet, despite that, it's still a better quality pad than this is. And all of this is ignoring the fibs of this being a Sankyo CF601. A real Sankyo CF601 would be made of solid silver, first of all, and would have soldered tone holes, not drawn tone holes. These are drawn tone holes. You can tell because they have this little bit of a loopy ring right at the edge of the rim. I have here a little sneak peek of a flute that will be used in a future video, but you can see this one, well, technically also has drawn tone holes, I believe, but they're much more in the soldered tone hole style with a flat, thick rim. You can see the difference here. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing is entirely up to your personal preference and what sound you like. However, soldered tone holes are significantly more expensive than drawn tone holes, and this certainly isn't one with soldered tone holes. Another thing that a CF601 would have that this does not is white gold springs. Now, I will say I have tried a flute with white gold springs before, but it was so long ago, I honestly can't remember it in good enough detail to describe the difference. But what I can tell you is that this magnet sticks to those springs just fine. All right, let's now continue our teardown of this flute. I must say I am missing my screwdriver. There goes the right-hand section and the drill keys. And now we have all of our keys out, and we can see that they are all filled with these horrid yellow pads. Interestingly, this is stamped. To be honest, I'm actually not sure if my Sankyo's pad cups are stamped or not. When making pad cups where the pad sits in, there's a couple of ways that flute manufacturers can do it. One method is called stamping, where they effectively put a round blank of sheet metal into a machine, which stamps and pushes it into a mold, which forms a particular shape, in this case, this cup shape. You can tell if something's been stamped because whatever is on the outside will be the opposite on the inside. So we can see over here, we have a little ring going down on the outside, which means on the inside we have a little rim going up. That results in a very cheap way to mass produce these pads. For this context, it's not something I'd be particularly concerned about, but to be honest, I'm now curious about whether the cheapest Sankyo also has stamped pad cups or has the other method, which is where you can either machine them or cast them. Either way, you will end up with a flat bottom in your pad cup. Now, I know that my Sankyo on this particular key is flat on the bottom, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the actual pad cups are. So let's check. Here we have my Sankyo's pad cup, And indeed, they do appear to also be stamped. Again, that's only really an issue in specific contexts. For example, like if you wanted to fit your flute with Strawbinger pads or Pizzoni S2 pads. Those pads require a completely flat bottom, so you have to have cups that have been machined rather than stamped like these ones. And in this specific instance, this part of the keywork also being stamped is just cosmetic then. You can tell that they're cheaping out, but $190 flute. Fair enough. Now to more pressing concerns. We can see now, having taken out all the pads, that they are all extremely soft and very poor, but none more so than this particular trill key that I pointed out earlier. That is egregious. I can also feel rattling in that. Those pads came out much more easily. Interesting. You can see the paper shims they've used to flat. Oh my gosh. It looks as though the pads we're using are Lucier Deluxe. For context, a very well-known and respected brand of pads is Lucien Deluxe, which are made by Pizzoni. That's amazing. They have genuinely copied everything except used an R instead of an N. That is so funny. So it turns out our rip-off high-end flute uses rip-off high-end pads. These are not Lucien Deluxe pads. This is hilarious. That might be the highlight of this teardown. Lucier Deluxe. We're now getting close to the end of this teardown looking at this flute, but for the final part, we'll be doing the most tedious part, and that is checking the levelness of the tone holes. What I have here is an extremely flat piece of glass, and hiding under here, some extremely thin strips of metal, along with a feeler gauge. What this will allow us to do is use this known flat surface to measure any inconsistencies in the tone holes. This will tell us whether or not they could be using a nicer quality pad and just have cheaped out on the pads, or whether their tone holes are indeed so abhorrently poor that they can't even use quality soft pads. But we're not just going to be looking at their tone holes in a vacuum. We are going to be comparing them to the Sankyo's tone holes, the lowest end model of a series of high-end flutes, a Trevor James TJ10X, a very nice student beginner model flute, and the foot joint of my Aldi flute, which I picked up for 50 bucks from an op shop. This should be rather interesting. All right, to start with our AliExpress flute. And again, just to make it clear, in case you're willing to risk damaging your flute, don't do this at home. So, how did the AliExpress flute do? Well, things started well with a less than 0.04mm gap on its lowest C tone hole. For some context, 0.01mm is the smallest gap we can measure and is considered a functionally perfect score. At this time, 0.1mm is the greatest disparity I'm comfortable calling satisfactory, and 0.2mm is so inaccurate that it automatically disqualifies a flute for me. As such, 0.4mm is a very good start for our rip-off flute. However, tone hole 2 is not nearly as good as tone hole 1, failing 0.03 and 0.04 and 0.05 and 0.06. How do they have two tone holes next to each other? One which is, as far as I can tell, perfect, and one which has got a whopping great gap. But it refuses to fail 0.07. Our C sharp tone hole was twice as inaccurate as our C tone hole. D got a reasonable below 0.05mm measurement, however D sharp had a far worse below 0.09mm reading. Not nearly as good, however, as I said while measuring, that should still, I believe, be more than enough for quality soft pads. But every tone hole needs to be that precise in order to pad every tone hole with those pads. As such, we're only interested in the worst tone hole here, and so we're giving the AliExpress flute a score of 0.09mm. Not fantastic, but still acceptable. So how did the Sankyo do? Now it's time for the Sankyo flute. That first tone hole, it puts up a perfect performance, less than 0.01mm. That second tone hole, putting up a similar perfect performance at somewhere less than 0.01mm. And that final tone hole also putting in a perfect less than 0.01 millimeter inaccuracy. In other words, this tone hole is so precise that I can't find anything inaccurate in it at all, at least with the tools that I currently have. It is as good as perfect. Yep, my Senko, despite being Senko's cheapest offering, not to mention also being about 25 to 30 years old, put up an impressive less than 0.01mm performance. That doesn't mean that it's truly perfect. Using a leak light, we can see light escaping the tone hole, meaning a gap does exist there. That said, that gap is so small, it's smaller than most visible dust particles. Yeah, smaller than dust. So Senko is clearly showing that you do get a better made flute for your money here. The Trevor James's results, however, were interesting, with results of 0.08, 0.09 and another 0.09 on its foot joint. It matched the AliExpress flute, meaning the AliExpress flute theoretically could use the same pads. This sent me on a little rant. So that means that while our AliExpress flute isn't even close to the quality of the Senko compared to the Trevor James, it's quite comparable. Now, it should be noted that this Trevor James is a 10X2, which is a much older model than the current one. It's entirely possible that if you were to buy a brand new Trevor James 10X, in fact, I think that they remade a new model in 2024, it's probably going to be a lot better than this particular model. Can't say for certain as I've never played one and never measured one. But even so, even if Trevor James' newer model is better, with soft pads that make up for its inaccuracies, it plays perfectly fine. It's just that the pads on our AliExpress flute are so soft that they become problematic. And yet, I guess it can't be because their tone holes are inaccurate, because clearly they're just as mediocre as the Trevor James ones. So they should be able to use the same pads, in which case most of my problems with this flute would be solved. But we still haven't asked the question of how it compares to the Aldi flute. I think this should be a really interesting one. Okay, this is so inaccurate I can see it with my bare eyes. 0.1 millimeters goes straight through. We're going to need a lot more than that. No. 0.2 millimeters goes through. But my next step up at 0.23 millimeters holds firm. Wow. So 0.2 of a millimeter inaccuracy. So the Aldi flute automatically disqualified itself. The similarity between the Trevor James and Senko ripoff, however, left me suspicious, so I decided off camera to go and test all the tone holes on the body of the Senko ripoff and compare them to the Trevor James. Here, the Trevor James really steps up its game. As it turns out, those foot joint tone holes were the worst on the flute, and most of the body tone holes fell between 0.01mm to 0.05mm, a far better result. The Senko ripoff, however, fell apart, with a worse tone hole beyond 0.23mm. That is far worse than the Aldi flute. And so big, I didn't even bother measuring beyond 0.23mm. So, as it turns out, the Senko ripoff is indeed using terrible pads because it has to. And for me, that's the last nail in the coffin for this flute. It's now been over 2 weeks since I first played it, and I've actually played this flute more than I have any other in those 2 weeks. And yet, the most enjoyment I've got from it has been taking it apart. To be clear, the instrument sounds fine. It looks fine. And in fact, I think some professionals who aren't used to playing student flutes might not notice anything wrong with it in 5 minutes of playing. But try what I did, playing it for an hour or 2 hours. You know those bad play days where no matter what you do, you just can't play at your best. You're not really happy with anything you can produce. Playing this flute is like having those days every day. And yet, it creates that sensation in stealthy ways that you might not quickly notice. I have to squeeze my fingers to get notes out. The trill keys have an insanely long travel, and yet at the end of it don't seem to fully develop the note. And D sharp has far more resistance than any of the other notes. That one was particularly annoying and threw me off a lot. Those D sharps, man. On songs I'm still learning, I found myself making far more mistakes than I normally would. And on pieces that I'm already used to, I didn't quite feel like I could get them out the way that I wanted. Oh, and these little prongs in the mechanism sit exactly where I put my thumb, which means anytime I play E, I stabbed myself. Now, some may be saying right now, Ethan, you're being too harsh. These are nitpicky details over a functional flute that costs less than $200, and that's all I have to spend. Surely this flute is better than none. And well, yes, if it was between no flute and this flute, I would take this flute every day of the week. But it isn't between this flute and no flute. If you're looking for the best value, low cost flute, yes, this flute has more features at a lower price than you'll likely find anywhere else. But features don't matter as much as playing quality. I urge you, save just a little more and buy a used quality student flute. My first Trevor James was $330. And while researching for this video, I found a Jupiter JFL 700E at a pawn shop for $216. Sure, they're more expensive. Sure, buying used flutes is more risky, but those flutes are much better, more enjoyable instruments. And for me, that risk is well worth it. And if for whatever reason you still want to buy a cheap AliExpress flute, just go buy one with a C-foot joint, closed holes and Y key arms. From what I've seen, the keys would probably be better put together and you'll save a whole lot of money, which you can then spend on a better flute when you inevitably want one. Most of the positive reviews on this flute are impressed by the sound. But here's the thing, the most important part of a metal flute sound is the player. A fantastic player will make a bad flute sound good, and a bad player will make a fantastic flute sound bad. So when buying a flute, however counterintuitive this sounds, your number one priority should not be how it sounds. Because, frankly, an audience of non-musicians usually can't tell the difference between flutes. Instead, your number one priority should be how the flute feels to play and how well it suits you as a player. Because while flutes don't tend to sound very different, they certainly feel very different. And while most audiences can't hear the difference between two functional flutes, they can tell when you're uncomfortable. And this flute will make you uncomfortable. And because of that, and the soft pads, and the build quality, and the grime when it arrived, and the terrible accessories in the bad case, and the lack of a brand, and the lack of any customer support or warranty, and the scratches all over it, and the poor adjustment, and a whole lot of other things we didn't get to talk about, because of all of those little and some not so little issues, I cannot recommend a rip-off Sankyo flute on AliExpress. I suppose that wasn't a very shocking conclusion, was it? Though thank you for joining me on the journey to discover that common sense, indeed, is usually correct. And hey, since you made it to the end, why not consider leaving a comment to let me know what you thought of this longer format video? This is actually the first video I've made longer than 10 minutes, so I'd be very appreciative of any feedback you might have. And hey, if you did like it, why not subscribe? I've got some more of these longer videos planned, and while you wait, you can check out some of our other content.